Happy Thursday evening. My name is Sarah Howard, and I'm the Youth and Community Services Manager here at the Dana Boone Regional Library. And welcome to our Zoom room and welcome to some bird fun. We are happy to have Dana Ripper here with us. She's the co-founder of the Missouri River Bird Observatory located in Arrow Rock, and actually many projects throughout the state. As she presents, feel free to put questions in the chat, and the questions will only go to Dana and myself. We also will be drawing for a door prize later this evening. After we get off, you have a delightful chance to win a book, Migrations, a lovely DBRL coffee mug, a lovely box winter reading bag, and some reusable silverware. So that's my Vanna White moment on there. But this evening, we're thrilled to have Dana with us. She's going to share the wonders of migrations, as well as pointing out some fiction and facts from our fall community one read book, Migrations from Charlotte McConaghy. So I'm going to magically disappear and let Dana take over. I will be putting some things in the chat as we go, and I'll come back at the end. So thank you, thank you, thank you, Dana.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everybody for joining us. Sarah, let me know if you cannot see slides for any reason or something's not working because I can't see or hear anyone else.
All good.
All good? All right. Okay. So we're going to take a little journey together this evening. I wanted to give you all some background first. I know that there are folks on here that I know and that know MRBO, but for folks that don't, we are a nonprofit organization based in Arrow Rock, Missouri, but as Sarah mentioned, we work all over the state. Our mission is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. We spend time monitoring birds and their habitats in Missouri's most imperiled ecosystems and in surrounding states. We do over 100 education events each year, and that's with a staff of 6 and a few seasonal folks. And as you can see there on the bottom, we do some conservation policy advocacy as well in Jefferson City here in Missouri, and sometimes even in Washington, D.C. So why do we do this? This is why. There are a lot of related factors here, but we started off, of course, we're a bird observatory. We started with birds, and we have lost almost 30% of our native bird populations in North America since 1970. A lot of folks may have seen these statistics before. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And so we have a lot of different topic areas in which we work. Here are some not so pleasant ones. But we work on habitat loss and degradation, ecotoxification, climate change, and direct causes of bird mortality. We'll talk about that a little bit. And of course, all of these things are very much related to the book Migrations. So we're going to try and weave a lot of these things in. So as far as MRBO's work, how we work on these things here on the left-hand side is we work in food system improvement. We work a lot on reducing plastic production specifically. We work on light pollution, which is super important for migration, bird window collisions, restoring and encouraging people to work with native plants, and then encouraging community engagement from people all over the place, from all demographics and all walks of life. So that is what we work on. I want to thank Daniel Boone Regional Library. We've been doing programs with them for years, and it's always really great. And I love Sarah Howard very much. And thanks to everyone that has come this evening. And so, just to remind myself to do this, we have a poll question, which I think I can launch. Okay, if folks would like to, I would love it if you answered this question. Let's see. Let's get the right one here. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this up here for 20, 30 seconds or so. So who has read the book Migrations? If you've read it, please let me know. Yes. So not yet. Ooh, we're moving around here. I don't know if you guys can see the results yet. I don't think so.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was a lot of movement, wasn't it? Okay, so, all right. Thanks to everyone for answering that question. All right, that helps me out a lot. So we've got about 15% of people who have read this book, and 80 some percent of folks, it's still changing a little bit, that have not yet read this book. Okay, that's good to know because I'll give you just a little bit of background. before we really get into stuff. Okay, and I'm going to share the results of the poll. So you all should be able to see that right now. So 13% to 87%. Okay, there we go. All right, so this book, y'all, it is an incredibly well written, incredibly engaging book. It is a book that I couldn't put down, but it is also really a very difficult book for anyone that cares at all about ecology and the environment and birds and the future of our planet. The book starts off with the line, "The animals are dying and soon we will be alone here." So when Sarah and I got together to talk about me doing this presentation, I hadn't read the book yet. And I was like, "Oh, sure, a book called Migrations. That sounds really good. I'd be happy to read the book and do a presentation on it." And then I read that first line and I was like, "Sarah, what have you gotten me into here? I really don't want to read this book actually." But I'm really glad I did. It does weave in it is a fictional book. It weaves in certainly scientific facts along with its fictional story and some embellishment in various situations. So I want to talk a little bit about those things and talk about bird migration in the context of this book and sort of understanding like the scientific underpinnings of this book. But I do warn people, if you will, that it is very dystopian, but it is based on reality. I mean, I would say that for myself and other environmental scientists and all kinds of folks that care about this, it is exactly what we fear is going to come to pass, basically. And it reminded me of Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management, who said one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And the rest of that quote goes, "Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise." So that's kind of where we're at. And I think that this book, for as sad and sometimes upsetting as it is, it really paints a picture, an emotional picture of what that might look like in the future. So we're going to talk a bit about some wonderful and good and inspiring things about it, and also, how likely is this sort of a future to come to pass. So a little bit of background about the book. Obviously, due to, as you can tell by its name, it is about the topic of migration, both bird migration and also some human imperative to migrate, both physical and also emotional. So we have a main character whose name is Franny Lynch. She's an Irish woman who has it's a very complex character, and she has an enormous amount of angst about what is happening in the world. And we follow her as she gets married to a professor of biological sciences, who, if anything, has more of a dark view of the world than she does even. And we follow her adventures mostly and their adventures collectively. And the book starts off with Franny saying, "Once, when the animals were really going, really and truly, and not just in warnings of dark futures, but now, right now, in mass extinctions we could see and feel, I decided to follow a bird over an ocean. Maybe I was hoping it would lead me to where they'd all fled, all of those of its kind, all the creatures we thought we'd killed. Maybe I'd discover whatever cruel thing drove me to leave people and places and everything always. Or maybe I was just hoping the bird's final migration would show me a place to belong." So there's a lot to identify with in this character, but not to give away the story for folks that haven't read the book. But she has her Zuganru, this migration anxiety, having migratory restlessness of her own in and of herself, tends towards the self-destructive end of the spectrum, as one can see reading the book. So let's talk a little bit about the other main character in the book, which is this glorious bird right here, the Arctic tern. So when she says that she decided to follow a bird over an ocean, this is the bird that she is talking about. She's talking about the Arctic tern. The book opens in Greenland with her trying to catch terns and put transmitters on them to track them across the ocean. And then the book kind of goes on wherein she talks her way onto a fishing vessel to be able to follow the birds from Greenland down to Antarctica and all of the adventures that ensue there. Um, but the depiction of the Arctic tern in terms of its range, which you can see here on this map, you have breeding in the Arctic there in the peach color, and then their wintering range in blue down in the Antarctic. The depiction of this bird, and including its range and its migration patterns, is certainly accurate. The book speaks a lot about this, the fact that this species, as it moves southward in the wintertime towards the Antarctic, it leaves the north and then does this sort of like split migration pathway, which is fairly unusual and really, really interesting. And as they follow the birds on the fishing vessel, they get to that point off the west coast of Africa, and it's like, which one should we follow? Because the few birds that she has tagged split routes. They split off from each other. And their decision-making process in terms of which one they should follow is interesting in and of itself, and they discuss some of the biology of the Arctic tern at that time. So this species is considered of least concern. Its populations in many places are relatively stable. You can read for yourself here the sort of division between Western and Eastern hemispheres up in the north. And the global population is estimated at more than 2 million individuals, which is pretty darn good for a bird. I mean, we have to kind of step back and be like, well, there are 8 billion of us, so like 2 million isn't, really that many. But other than some concerns, as you can see down in the second paragraph here, Massachusetts and Maine considered threatened. In New Hampshire, but throughout most of its range, it's currently quite stable. I wanted to look at a couple of other interesting species that have pretty fantastic migrations, just to do, just to talk about a couple others that are not necessarily considered the champion. The Arctic tern is considered the champion of migration because of the sheer length of its migration. But I also wanted to bring up this guy, the bar-tailed godwit. And I'm sorry that it's like a little hard to see the text on the bottom right there. This is actually a photograph from a Royal Society for the Protection of Birds Preserve in Wales. And you can see the text in Welsh there on the very bottom. But though Arctic terns travel further, bar-tailed godwits undertake the longest non-stop flight. They take a non-stop flight of over 11,000 kilometers. So let's look at a couple maps of transmitted birds, and I want to read a little bit about this. So back in 2021, in September, an adult male bar-tailed godwit, and that is the map there on the right-hand side of the page. Adult male bar-tailed godwit completed a record-breaking flight as it touched down in New South Wales, Australia, after a continuous migration of more than 8,100 miles that began in western Alaska. This godwit literally flapped its wings for 239 continuous hours to set the world record for the longest continuous flight recorded for any land bird. This same male bar-tailed godwit previously held the world record for his 2020 flight of 7,580 miles. But just 3 days before his touchdown in Australia, and this is now going to be the map on the left, a female bar-tailed godwit completed a migration of a similar distance that was briefly considered the record flight, and it took her 8 days and 12 hours at an average speed of 35 miles an hour. Although the record-breaking godwit's migration feats are astounding, these are not particularly surprising. Bar-tailed godwits regularly complete ultra-long migrations, with individuals regularly making continuous flights of more than 7,000 miles. So, pretty impressive. Another species that I want to mention, and again, this picture was also taken in Wales. This is around the time that I was reading this book for the first time and learning all these different things about Eastern Hemisphere species that I thought was quite interesting and also very much related to this book and this presentation. But if you look at this, the swift, This sign is telling us that whilst an Arctic tern migrates from the Antarctic to the Arctic and back again, at least it can have a stop every now and again. From the moment the young swift leaves its nest in midsummer, it keeps flying until at least the next year. It feeds and drinks and sleeps and breeds in flight. So that's pretty I find that staggeringly amazing. So our marathon medal goes to the swift. So what about our birds? I've talked a little bit about birds in other places. So here in North America, about 70% of our birds migrate, and 350 or so species of 650 or so, roughly, species in North America are long distance migrants, and we'll talk about what that means. So 70% of our birds, and of those, and this will become important a little bit later, 80% of those that migrate do so at night. So here's a little bit of the breakdown from Missouri. 335 species present approximately. We've got 170 breeders, and 84 leave Missouri in the non-breeding season, so about half, and then 80, excuse me, 80, 58 of those leave the continental US in the non-breeding season. So about a third of our birds in Missouri leave the United States entirely. So just to talk a little bit about definitions, permanent residents, of course, these are going to be our cardinals and our titmice and a lot of our woodpeckers, a lot of our familiar backyard birds are permanent residents. They do not migrate. They do tend to kind of shift their diets around a little bit depending on the time of year, but they're able to find adequate supplies of food all year round here. Short distance migrants might move from higher to lower elevations on a mountainside. A lot of folks also consider some of our like slightly nomadic species. So for instance, American goldfinch to be short distance migrants. They do move, and they will move from a place and stay in another place for weeks to months, but it's a very short distance. Whereas medium distance migrants cover distances of dozens or a few hundred miles. So, thinking about it in the US, they go a few states south, so say to the Gulf Coast. And then long distance migrants make what we say are hemispheric movements from the US and or Canada to Central and South America here in the Western Hemisphere. So why? Well, I already gave some of it away, and I'm sure you all probably can understand this anyway. So basically moving from areas of low resources or decreasing, such as when we go into winter and there's a lot less food to go around, to areas of high resources. The two primary resources being sought are food, of course, and during the breeding season, nesting locations. So how? And this gets pretty interesting, and it gets into why migration is really such an amazing phenomenon. So birds can get compass information, what we would think of as compass information, from the sun, stars, and sometimes, in some species at least, it has been tested that they are sensing the Earth's magnetic field. They can get information, of course, from, celestial bodies, particularly the sun, the moon, and from landmarks being seen during the day. And many are following pathways, such as, if you can imagine a river system, for instance, to stopover locations as they're migrating along. So I'm going to show a couple of these really neat, colorful occurrence maps that come from Cornell. When I hit this button, what you are going to see is the slider right here going from January, February, March, and so forth and so on. And you will see the indigo bunting's relative abundance as measured largely by citizen scientists throughout the hemisphere on things like eBirds. So you will kind of see their pathways and how they come and go. Now it's June, they're breeding. Now we're getting ready to go back south. We're going back south, and we've gone back south, and it's December. Our ruby-throated hummingbird, same type of map. Ruby-throated hummingbird, as did the indigo bunting, crossed the Gulf of Mexico to migrate up to the US for the breeding season, and then went back down to southern Mexico and Central America for the winter. So I don't have that animated map for the gray cheek thrush, but I did just kind of want to show they're pretty amazing long distance migrants. They do not breed in the United States. As you can see here, the yellow is migration, and the peach color is where they breed, and the blue color is where they winter. So just a really neat long distance migrant thrush species that we do, does occur in Missouri. We can see and hear their wonderful song in Missouri, particularly during spring migration. So they come through here on their very, very long journey. So, other than sort of the fictional adventure story and philosophical underpinnings of the book Migrations, a lot of it is simply about understanding bird migration and kind of how that's done and how to follow and track birds as they are in migration. And as we'll see in just one second, the methodology that is used in the book is pretty accurate to what happens now. Historically, though, we did not have these radio trackers and these satellite trackers that we have these days. What was typically done to understand bird migration was bird banding, and you can see a lot of different pictures ranging from, I believe, the 1930s and 40s up to more of the present, where folks would put numbered bands on birds and hope that they would catch them again or that someone else would catch them and report them. And we would know kind of at least where they were at any given finite period of time. The return rate or the recovery rate of bands was typically less than 1%. So of the hundreds of thousands of birds banded in the US, possibly millions, over the course of migration studies, very few of them actually were recaptured and had their bands read, and so gave us that information. But because of the sheer volume of birds that were banded throughout all of these different scientific operations, we did have a pretty decent glimpse as to where birds were stopping and where they were going. Um, in addition to just people's observations. Nowadays, though, and including in the course of this book, we have a lot of different technologies that have gotten way, way better, even over the last 20 years or so. So here we have an actual Arctic tern with a satellite transmitter affixed, and this is where our book begins. Franny, our main character, up in Greenland, catching terns on their breeding grounds. And she's got one in her hands, and she says, I have to be quick now, but I've been practicing, and so I am. My fingers swiftly looping the band over her leg, shifting it over the joint to the upper stretch beneath her feathers. She makes a sound I know too well. The plastic tightens firmly on her leg, keeping the tracker in place. It blinks once to tell me it's working. And just as I am about to let her go, she turns very still so that I can feel her heartbeat pounding inside of my palm. And then she lets the bird go, and the transmitter does work. Typically, transmitters are placed as you see in this picture, not really around birds' legs, but otherwise, that was a fairly accurate description of catching and tagging a bird. So I would think that some of the folks on here know Sarah Kendrick, who was the state ornithologist here in Missouri, and now she's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the migratory bird biologist for our region. Um, she has really expanded on a project that the previous state ornithologist, Brad Jacobs, started, working with our quote unquote Missouri birds on their breeding grounds in Central America. And that work is carried on still by Sarah and also by Kristen, who is our current state ornithologist. And I was fortunate enough to join them on a mission to Costa Rica and to tag some golden winged warblers, which is what you see on the right hand side there, and wood thrushes in various habitats in Costa Rica. These are birds that will come up here to Missouri to breed, and we tag them with modus tags. I hope folks can see that there's like a little antenna sticking off the golden winged warbler here. So I'm not, this is, a whole talk in and of itself. And Sarah has actually done talks for us at MRBO and a bunch of other talks that you can find on YouTube that really get into the entire Modus wildlife tracking system. But basically, those little transmitters, like you saw the antenna sticking off of the golden wing warbler, they will like register on towers that are placed for the Modus project. So you can see kind of the schematic here. I'll show a picture in a minute of what an actual MODIS tower looks like. But the nano tag will be registered by that tower. And so once a bird is tagged, biologists can collect those data from the towers and see where these birds are going. Of course, what this takes is a bunch of MODIS towers out there that are receiving this information. And that is one of the things that Sarah and others have really, really spearheaded and pushed along throughout our region is the establishment of more and more towers. So you can see here, this picture is from a few months ago, but this is where we're getting the amount of towers. They're able to, terrain dependent, they can pick up a tag on a bird up to about 15 kilometers. And so this is on the right-hand side here. This is in Costa Rica on a patio. As you can see, we've got some elevation here. This is what a MODIS tower can look like. So we've gone from, the very, very primitive, really, numbered bands on birds that we just sort of like hope someone else catches them and we learn about it, to this much more technologically advanced system of studying bird migration. So again, how about our birds? Our birds here in Missouri, and I keep putting quotes because they actually spend a little bit less of the year here than they do on their wintering grounds and in migration. But still, I think a lot of us that know them and love them think of them as ours. So I know that quite a few folks that are on this webinar tonight have seen these statistics before. This was a very many major media covered this study that came out in Science a few years ago that showed through very careful and robust aggregation of data that we have lost all these birds. And this is in North America. So this is what's kind of happening with our birds. Of migratory birds, we have lost about 28%, including birds that are quite familiar to us and are quite iconic within our culture, such as the Baltimore Oriole. So we've lost 2 in 5 orioles since 1970. So why migratory birds? Why are they, taking such a hit? Well, one of the reasons is because they're migratory birds. Migration is an incredibly perilous endeavor. It's physically challenging. There are obstacles sometimes, such as extreme weather events, a lot of competition for food resources along the way, and sometimes extremely variable conditions as far as food resource availability is concerned, and of course, predation. So one of the instances that happen in the book Migration is that they're out on the fishing vessel that Franny has talked herself onto, and they're out in the open ocean, North Atlantic, and what happens is this: the birds, the terns that they're following, are tired already, even so early in the journey, so it's lucky that we've come to find them. They make a beeline for us, and as though the sky has shattered into falling, flapping pieces, they land on the boat, all over it, at least 20 of them. They fold their wings and gaze calmly at the passing world, happy to catch a ride. So you have a situation where these birds are so very tired that they have hitched a ride on this boat, and we can I'm going to show you all something just here in a second here that is not necessarily a fictional happening. So the terms on the right there, the bullet point, or excuse me, on the left: physical challenges, weather, food resources, predation, etc. Those are natural conditions that have been there throughout the course of evolution as birds evolved in their migration and their migratory pathways. In the meantime, we humans are throwing up pretty much every possible barrier that we can do to their survival, and migrants are particularly effective. So the bullet points on the right-hand side there, shrinking habitat, shifting climate that is causing associated extreme weather events, which I know we're all very cognizant of right now with the fires in California. So we're decimating food resources. We have things that interfere with their navigation, such as light pollution, and then the other things that you can see there. So we've really taken this life history activity of theirs that is, crucial to their existence that they've evolved to do, and we've thrown up a whole heck of a lot of additional obstacles into a very perilous situation. So the physical challenges and some of which I just described from in this book, it literally is tiring. And there are quite a few instances of documentation where birds land on ships, and where there are what we call fallouts. So many different birds of many different species, particularly warblers, tanagers, birds that we think of as songbirds, falling out of migration, coming out of migration to rest on not just boats, but offshore oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, because many of our species are crossing the Gulf of Mexico in one flight, especially during spring, to get up to breeding sites. And it's tiring. And what if they hit a weather front or just, some bad weather in general? And so it's a little bit ironic that, these bits of infrastructure that are contributing in their way to some of these changing conditions that are making migration even more perilous, but sometimes do provide a short-term respite for migrating birds. So I want to talk a little bit about light and light pollution and our human habit of putting out a lot of artificial light at night into our environment. Excuse me, this is a I believe a lithograph is the right word from the early 1900s showing birds circling around a lighthouse. So we've known for a long time that birds are attracted by light, and if they, keep circling it and keep it and stay in the area of the light beams, they eventually get quite disoriented. And we've known this for a really long time. So, what does that look like from, sort of a larger scale, a continental scale? So, here we have satellite pictures, of course, of artificial light at night from our human cities and towns in the late 1950s. And here's the 70s, late 90s, and now. So we have lit up the night sky excessively, particularly over the last 60 to 70 years or so. And this is, it's going to have an impact on migratory birds and their navigation. And there are plenty of studies out there showing that that is the case. Does anyone know what this is? If you do know, you can go ahead and put it in chat if you like. I can see the chat. Anyone know? I don't see anything yet. So this is, I bet there are people on here that know. I think some of you have seen this picture before. This is the 9/11 Memorial in Light in New York City at the site of the World Trade Center. And those are birds that are trapped in the light. So just a very dramatically illustrative example of how we can attract and sort of trap and disorient migrating birds with our artificial lights at night. Okay, so to address, some more of the barriers that we kind of put in the place of migration, habitat, of course, is getting even scarcer. And to go back to the book again for a second, Franny's husband, Niall, says, "Nobody needs to be told of the extinction of the animals. For years now, we've been watching news bulletins about habitat destruction and species after species being declared first endangered and then officially extinct. There is hardly anything wild left, and this is a fate we are all of us intimately aware of." And I think that I don't know that anybody cannot be aware of that at this point. And we're at a point where you can see this headline from Forbes on the screen: about 3% of Earth's land surface is still ecologically intact. And so, an example from right here in Missouri, tallgrass prairie, the darker peach color there is the extent of native tallgrass prairie in the state of Missouri at the time of European colonization. And there you can see the extent of native tallgrass prairie now. So we've lost all but a little less than 1% of it, this very, very diverse habitat that a lot of different wildlife species relied upon, particularly our prairie obligate birds. And so we've gone from, 14 million or so acres to less than 60,000 acres of native unplowed tallgrass prairie. And I mean, just from thinking about it logically, like, what do we think is going to happen to the wildlife that had evolved with and was totally dependent on that ecosystem? Like, there's not very much left for them to live in. And so they're going to be far fewer of them, of course. I love this picture. I love what it's called. It's by Missouri photographer David Seidensticker, and this is our greater prairie chicken. And we here at MRBO, Ethan and I, since we started this organization in 2010, we have seen this species become extirpated from the state of Missouri. To me, that's a really big deal. It's it is still alive. It is still extant in some other states, not doing great, but still there. But it's extinct in the state of Missouri functionally at this point. And so that's something that we've seen just in the last 15 years. But there simply isn't enough unbroken acreage of native tallgrass prairie left to support this species. In our book, Migrations, certainly it is very, very much focused on the sea and sea associated birds, not as much land associated birds, but sea birds. And a lot of what they've talked about is overfishing. They're again, without really giving away a lot of the book, there are some scenes of conflict between the crew of the fishing boat that Franny has hitched a ride on and activists that are still trying to kind of save the oceans, despite the fact that things are like pretty decimated by the time this book takes place. And Franny is conversing with one of the fishermen, and she's trying to be nice because she's hitched a ride on this fishing boat, but she's thinking to herself, they were warned time and again. We all were. The fish will run out. The ocean is nearly empty. You have taken and taken, and now there is nothing left. And so you can see this chart that's on here, and there's not nothing left right now, but we do have more than a third of the ocean fisheries are overfished and unsustainable, and another like 57% are pretty much at their max. We really can't keep taking anymore. So that is, while the book portrays it in the future and we are not there yet, it is probably not inaccurate that we are certainly over harvesting from the oceans. And that of course is affecting birds and other wildlife species that are feeding on various fish. Relatedly, I always have to go back to land. I live in the center of the country, totally landlocked. I think about land a lot. But the analogous situation, of course, to the fisheries and to how that looks going further up the food chain in the ocean ecosystem, the analogy is, of course, our insects on land. And this is something that is genuinely frightening. We are experiencing enormous declines in insects. A lot of times, this is framed, and I think rightly so, as serious concern over how we're going to be pollinating our own crops as humans. But of course, the serious declines in insects are also affecting everything that eats insects, which is 97% of our bird species in North America and any number of amphibians, reptiles, mammals, other insects, etc. I promise y'all, I promise I have like two more very unhappy, not positive things to talk about, and then we'll get to how we're going to work on this. We're going to get to some solutions. So once again, we're on the boat and Franny is looking out and she says, today there is a huge land mass to our left, and it surprises me because there is no land on the charts I've been studying. As we draw close enough to see, I realize that it's an enormous island of plastic, and there are fish and seabirds and seals dead upon its shore. Unfortunately, this is also pretty accurate, and the effects of our excessive production and use and lack of proper waste management of plastic are showing themselves all over the place. As far as birds are concerned, we've actually started seeing effects in many different species to the point where there has been a wildlife disease called plasticosis named for the effects that ingesting plastic is having on seabirds particularly. So I'm not going to talk any more about this particular topic, but I am going to ask Sarah to put a link in the chat if you are interested in diving deeper into the topic of plastic specifically. We do a lot of work on this topic, as do a lot of other organizations. So she's going to put a link to a flyer there in the chat for some soon upcoming events that you could join. So in one part of the book, Franny's husband is talking about the Bermuda petrel, and it is a very dramatic portion of the book. He talks about how this species was found after several hundred years of being thought extinct. So in 1951, by sheer accident, the species was found again, only 18 pairs of them. They were hiding, nesting in the cliffs of small islands. He says, they did not survive our second attack. With the burning of fossil fuels, we changed the world. As the climate grew hotter and the sea levels rose, the Bermuda petrels were washed from their burrows and drowned. So I did not know of this bird really, and I wondered how much of that story that Niall Lynch, the professor in the book, told was true. And it turns out it's pretty accurate. The Bermuda petrel is doing okay. It was, in fact, thought extinct by the 1620s, thanks to a lot of conservation efforts and extensive legal protection. When it was refound, it was 17 or 18 breeding pairs, and it rose up to 132 breeding pairs by 2019. So where it is accurate, they haven't been washed from their burrows and drowned. That has not happened. But the main threats for the future of this species is still the lack of suitable breeding sites and ongoing erosion of the nesting islands due to hurricane impacts and sea level rise. So it is still a species of concern because it is very much threatened by those changes in climate. So we can see here, this is the one of our measures of climate change. This is the CO2 concentration at Mauna Loa Observatory, and you can see how it's gone up and up and up and up throughout the last 80 or so years. And so, climate change is not news. There were folks, including some of these gentlemen right here, John Tyndall, discovering that carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, trapped infrared radiation. Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist, proclaimed in 1896 that fossil fuels could accelerate the warming of the Earth because of the relationship between CO2 and temperature. So we've known this for a really long time, not news. One thing I found interesting when I was looking at some of the scientists that were the front runners in explaining climate change was a female American scientist named Eunice Foote, and she was in Connecticut, and she was actually the first person to say in print that if CO2 levels were higher, the planet would be warmer. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but in 1856, she conducted an experiment showing that, deduced that an atmosphere of CO2 would give to our Earth a high temperature. So she actually is the first known person to connect these two things. However, she published, she put it in print, but didn't present it to any scientific society. So her experiment went relatively unnoticed. And then John Tyndall published the now famous paper and did not cite Foote's work, likely due to her status as an American and a woman. I don't know which is worse, but clearly she was was not given credit, and I thought that was a really interesting backstory. So we know this, right? We know that we have unprecedented warming in terms of the rapidity of it. I read something a couple days ago that said that several different agencies and academies around the world have definitively confirmed 2024 as the hottest year on record for us. And the problem is not, sometimes folks like to say, well, the climate has always changed. Well, yes, it has, but it hasn't done it like this in 150 years. Things are not going to be able to catch up. So we know what's happening. I encourage folks to read this plaque that is dedicated to a now extinct glacier in Iceland. I think that it is very descriptive of the fact that we do know, and that only future generations will know if we actually rose to the challenge or not. So let's see, where am I at here? So around the time that I was reading the Migrations book, as I mentioned, at one point during it, Ethan and I were in Wales actually, and I made the huge mistake of looking on my phone for news from the US. Wanted to kind of check in, see what was going on, and this is one of the first things that I saw in the feed. So this was August 13th, 2024, record-setting heat waves baking the Arctic region. Scroll down a little bit further, and this was like one of the next articles. And I genuinely am not trying to be partisan by showing this. What I want to show is more the influence that this industry has on our government here in the United States, and the fact that these things are side by side in news feeds. And we know that fossil fuels are causing this climate change problem, and we just, kind of put articles side by side and say like, oh well, this is just the way that it's going to go, apparently. So why are we allowing it? And I would like to read just a couple more things from the book here. So Niall the professor says, and he's actually giving a lecture to a class in a lecture hall. The world was a different place once. Once there were creatures in the sea so miraculous they seemed straight out of fantasy. There were things that loped across plains or slithered through tall grass, things that leapt from the boughs of trees, which were plentiful too. Once there were glorious winged beasts that roamed the sky, and now they are going. They aren't going, he corrects himself. They are being violently and indiscriminately slaughtered by our indifference. It has been decided by our leaders that economic growth is more important, that the extinction crisis is an acceptable trade for their greed. But then, later he said it's hard to finish sometimes. He called himself a hypocrite for always talking, never doing. And he said he hates himself as much as anyone. He's as much a perpetrator, a consumer living in wealth and privilege and wanting more and more and more. So that sort of reminded me of this. It is our leaders choosing economy, and sometimes greed over the environment. But this is a poll that came out from a YouGov survey, and Americans are split. Do we want to protect the environment, or do we want to continue being comfortable and making money? The problem is that is a narrative that has been framed badly, unfortunately, and sometimes purposefully, to get us to have this like zero sum. Do you want this or this? Because you can't have both. And that's simply not true. Certainly, on a long term basis, we are probably not going to have economic well being, and certainly not physical health and well being, without a healthy environment. So I would say that a lot of what leads to things like that poll, where Americans are like, oh no, rather have the economy than the environment, a lot of that is due to misinformation and due to a narrative that is meant to have us come to that idea that it's one or the other, and that we can't have both. So last poll question here: knowing all of the things that we know, which we know a lot, do you think that we are going to make the big changes that would result in both longer term economic stability and a clean and healthy environment? I'm pulling for yes. I'm pulling for yes, but be honest. All right. Thanks everybody for answering. I really appreciate that. Let's see. Pretty good. I can understand the pessimism, especially after everything that I just said, but I also appreciate the optimism. I think it's really important that we do make big changes. Let's see, close that. So I think one thing that I find hopeful, I know that the toad, the funny frog toad thing is not hopeful, but we really do shape the world. So we have chosen, and not all cultures and countries have chosen the same way, right? So there's like living evidence that we can choose a different way. We shape the world by what we do and the choices we make, and I mean that more collectively than individually, but we're going to talk a little bit about some individual stuff to here at the end. But we shape the world. We have the power to do it. We are kind of dominating the whole place here. So we can make it look like those things, or, we can do things like raise our food on native ecosystems, and, surround our own habitations with things like native plants and diversity. So we can make these things happen. So I'm kind of sorry about this slide. I realize it's really, really busy, but I wasn't sure how to put this out there to y'all, because I feel really strongly about this. So there are a lot of things that we can do to help reverse these bird declines. Um, I know that things like climate change and habitat loss and all the things that I just talked about in relation to this book are very overwhelming, but there are totally things we can do. So, direct mortality of birds by outdoor cats and by them hitting windows, not fun. These are not fun pictures, but these are like really pretty simple situations that have very, very simple solutions. It's not like the complexities of climate change or habitat loss or whatever. And you can see there in the graph on the right hand side, these things have enormous consequences for bird populations. So when we make these things not happen, we do a lot to help bird populations. So surrounding the whole like birds and mortality in the built environment, I showed you a little bit before about light pollution. Don't be this guy. No one likes having a light shine at them, in their window at night or anything. But it also is, of course, very, very disoriented, as we saw, to migrating birds. There are a lot of different ways, excuse me, that you can design your lighting so that it will be an absolute win-win, both better for people and also better for birds and other wildlife as well. So, what is this again? This is the 9/11 Memorial in Lights. So, one of the most sort of important, poignant, and significant memorials, certainly in our country, right? This is what happens. People volunteer and they sit at the base of the memorial in light, and when a couple hundred birds are trapped in the light, they turn the lights off at the 9/11 Memorial in Light for just a little while and let the birds disperse again and let them go on their migratory way. And if we can do this with something that is that important to us collectively, I think we can make big progress with lights just on our homes and on our neighborhoods. Again, last slide that I'm very sorry about here, guys, but I wanted to show folks the math. So there's a lot of information and press around the big collisions that happen on skyscrapers and really tall office buildings. But because of the sheer numbers of residences and low-rise buildings in the world, and certainly in our country, many, many more birds are killed on residences and low-rise buildings. And this, again, is something that we can do something about. So birds don't perceive glass, and add that to artificial light at night being disorienting. You kind of have a recipe for birds to come down into our built environments and hit glass. And there's lots of different ways to treat your windows, lots of different methods for keeping birds from hitting your windows. And it's something that if you think about, if you save, 3 or 4 birds a year on your house, what if another million people did that, or 2 million? I mean, the math gets really, really good and really positive really quickly. So briefly, a success story. This is McCormick Place on the shore of Lake Michigan in Chicago. It has long been known as a horrible place for birds to be hitting this building because of the mirrored facade. And last in migration of, let's see, 2023, they had 1,000 birds hit this building in one night, and that caused a huge public outcry. McCormick's Place spent, admittedly, quite a lot of money, but they did it all right. They had it professionally done. They treated all their windows. So instead of an average of 7 to 900 birds during fall migration hitting this one building in Chicago, last fall they had 18. So this stuff really works. They're luckily due, in my opinion, largely due to Dr. Doug Talmy and his work. His books and his speaking really kind of started it, and it has really, really taken off, of course. But all of us landscaping and gardening with native plants and providing those diverse species of vegetation that then are inhabited and fed upon by diverse insects and diverse birds and all the way throughout the food web. So this also is an incredibly important thing that we can do just around our own home. Um, Even if you live in an apartment, you can have potentially like plants on your balcony, just a few native plants, a couple milkweeds. And if so, Dr. Talamy's homegrown national park organization, has posed the opportunity challenge that if we all did this in our residential spaces, that we would have more native plant habitat than like 20 of our national parks combined, including things like Yellowstone and Great Smoky Mountains in terms of acreage. So that's how much potential, how much power we have as residents living in urban, rural, and suburban areas to really change the landscape. And finally, so I talked a little bit about the project in Costa Rica and a lot of Sarah Kendricks and others' working with birds. I mentioned that we did some of that work in coffee plantations. So you can see here from this diagram that some coffees can be grown under shade trees, under a native canopy, and unfortunately, a lot of coffee is sun grown. So the forest is cut down so that coffee plants can be grown. For our birds that migrate to Central and South America, and of course, for the hundreds of species of resident birds that are in Central and South America year round, this is a very significant situation where what we choose as a coffee product can have serious effects on their habitat. It can either be, you know, single plant, coffee plant monocultures, or it can be a relatively diverse forest with coffee grown under the canopy. So bird friendly coffee has become more and more available. If you're interested, I can find something to put in the chat at the end of this. And okay, really finally, local and sustainably raised food. And so again, this is another topic that it's very huge and complex. But one of the reasons that we have lost so much habitat, of course, is the way that we humans are raising our food. And there are lots and lots of folks that are either returning to more diverse, sustainable, sort of patchwork farming that was traditional, or they're coming up with innovative ways to have more regenerative agriculture. So by sort of getting engaged with your local food system and getting your food locally from good growers is again a huge way that you can contribute to conservation. Hopefully folks that read the book remember the crows. Val, if you're still on here, this one's for you. When I was 6 years old, my mother used to sit with me in our back garden to watch the crows perch in the huge willow tree. In winter months, the long hanging leaves would turn white like the snow on the ground, or like the wispy whiskers of an ancient man, and the crows hiding among them were stark spots of coal. To me, they were the presence of something profound, though at 6, I didn't know what. Something like loneliness, or its opposite. They were time in the world. They were the distances they could fly and the places to which I could never follow. Mom told me to never feed them or they'd grow dangerous, but when she went inside, I did it anyway. The crows began to follow me. One day, they began to bring me gifts in return. Little stones or shiny sweet wrappers were left in the garden or dropped near my feet. Paper clips and bobby pins, pieces of jewelry or rubbish, sometimes shells or rocks or bits of plastic. I kept each in a box that year by year had to grow bigger. Even when I forgot to feed the birds, they brought me gifts. They were mine and I theirs, and we loved each other. And finally, at the very end of the book, Franny and Niall are speaking about a crow's egg. And Franny goes to pick it up, and Niall says, "Don't touch it." And Franny says, "We have to take it back to its nest." And Niall says, "If you touch it, the mother bird will smell you on it and reject it," which I would like to point out is not true. It's one of the only few glaring, scientifically inaccurate statements in this book, actually. But Franny just wants to take it and help it. We just leave it there, won't it die? And he says, "The less we touch, the better. All our touching does is destroy." And she argues with him, and he finally looks at her, and at first there's a shadow of pity and of understanding the way of things better than she does in his pessimism. But Franny returns the look, and she says, "I let him see my own certainty, let him see perhaps a hint of how we don't always have to be poison, a plague on the world. of how we can nurture it too. And slowly something shifts in his eyes. So I agree with Franny at the end of the book. I don't think we have to be poison and a plague on the world. I think we can nurture it too, and I think that we can make those choices and make big changes. So I encourage folks to read the book. I'm done speaking. I think I have a slide just to say, yeah, if just more opportunities. We have a whole webinar series going on. It's not me talking for an hour and 10 minutes. You can see the link there. And then we have a lot of stuff about all of these different topics and many more on our YouTube channel. So thanks
Thank you.
everyone for hanging with me. I know I'm a little bit over time. I appreciate you staying.
That's fine. Thank you, Dana. Think about it, folks, how much information we have in our brain and how much information Dana has given us to think about and some really easy things that we can do to help. So that's exciting too. We just had one question in the chat that was talking about, is there a place to actually find and buy shade grown coffee in the area?
Thank you, whoever asked that. Yes, yes. And to say a lot of places are selling it more and more. I mean, it's not like it's not super commonly available, don't get me wrong. Um, but for example, Bird's Eye View in Jefferson City, so just a little bit south of where you are, Sarah, in Columbia there. Bird's Eye View is on Ellis Boulevard. It's an awesome store anyway. They've got a bunch of cool bird stuff, and Steve and Regina Gar are some of my favorite people in the world that own the store, and they sell Birds and Beans coffee. They're we actually carry it at MRBO's store in Arrow Rock and online. We are open like August to October on weekends. So like we're not open right now, but we do sell it online. But it does have to be shipped. So I when we're not open, I certainly would encourage people to find a more locally available source. Um, for Kansas Cityans that are on here, the roastery, I had a really long talk with our master naturalist board chair and the guy that basically sources coffee for the roastery in Kansas City. They do not have Smithsonian bird friendly certification, but he gave us a lot of information about how incredibly careful they are when they source their coffee. They have higher ecological standards than most certification programs, and so and plus they're very much into like how they're sourcing to bring back to an urban area in the United States might affect the local economy and local jobs. So I would recommend them. Let me find a link in the chat, or let me find a link really, really quickly, and I will
Yes,
put it in the chat.
and while you do that, I'll let you know that a couple local people have said that Songbird Station here in
Oh,
Columbia has
good.
got some
Songbirds.
shade grown coffee,
Nice.
and
Thank you guys.
someone else put that Aldi's sometimes has it. So
Wow.
that's exciting. Okay.
I'm I'm
Well,
very glad to hear that Songbird Station carries it. I'm just gonna put Smithsonian. They are the certification. There's good shade grown coffee out there that does not have a certification. It's a complicated and potentially semi-onerous process for a small producer like in a Central American country. So like to me that's not a deal breaker, but it's a good place to start and it's a good place to learn about it.
well, I want to thank Dana again. You guys can all applaud at your locations because that was a lot of time and energy to put this presentation together to incorporate the book along with the things. And so I'm glad you got to do it twice, actually, to be able to get the word out there. We did record this, so it will be up on our library YouTube. So if you know someone that wanted to come and couldn't come, that will be available probably next week. And I'm sure you all will promote it too, Dana. So people can see it if they didn't get to be here tonight. So good evening and have a lovely evening. And one of you is a lucky door prize winner. So I'll reach out to you and let you know if you win the door prize. So thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Sarah.